XIX Nixon, Part 5. Moving into the election of 72. We just got done talking about his foreign affairs accomplishments. But what's going to trip up Richard Nixon and cause his historical reputation to be not good are domestic issues. But it wraps around the election of 72. So we'll talk about the election of 72 first. Okay, so remember, Nixon's gone to China. The election's before we get the Paris Peace Accords, but the progress is being made. He's working on things with the Soviets. And he's the incumbent. The incumbent president has an advantage going into the election. He's the devil that you know versus the devil that you don't know. And he's visible. He's on TV all the time, makes speeches. Okay. So Nixon will run in 72. His Democratic, I'm going to go ahead and talk a minute because I think the next slide shows the opponent in the map like all in one thing. All right. His Democratic opponent is a guy named George McGovern. Okay, McGovern. Okay, like Mayor McCheese. He was a senator. He was from one of the Dakotas. I think South Dakota, if I recall, but maybe it was North Dakota. But anyway, he's from that part of the country. George McGovern. George McGovern had flown bombers during World War II. Okay, he flew bombers out of Italy. Okay, so he's a war veteran. Okay, like a lot of people of that generation were. Okay. And he's on the liberal side of the Democratic Party. Okay, so remember, within a party, there's factions, but within a party. Okay, all right. So McGovern has managed to get to the top of the ticket. I'm sure people were running against him. I don't remember who, but he's one who wins the primaries. Okay, and manages to go up against Nixon. McGovern is not going to do well. I think the next slide should be the map. Okay, there's Nixon. Oh, I forgot an entire slide. There's not much on this one though. Okay, new federalism. Okay, Nixon would kind of like to get some power back to the states. Remember, the New Deal had greatly increased the power of the national government. Then World War II had done the same, and then it didn't ease back a lot. And then we had the Cold War. Then we had the Great Society with Johnson trying to do all these programs. And Nixon's one of these guys going, maybe we need to try to return some power to the states, that everything doesn't necessarily have to come out of Washington. Okay? So it's not a new idea, but maybe he wants to emphasize it a little more than, say, Johnson would have. Okay? And Nixon says he represents the silent majority. And what does this mean? Well, basically what it boils down to is you've got the population of the United States. Okay? And there's maybe 10% that are on the far left. Everyone's protesting and yelling at people. And then maybe there's like 10% on the far right, okay, who are just as vocal or whatever. What Nixon is saying is there's the vast majority of the people in the country that you don't hear from. Because you know what? They're relatively content with the way things are being run. All right? They're just trying to go about their lives, trying to make some money to get the kids to college, maybe buy a new car, take a vacation, and they don't have time to go out and do crusades or protests or, all this kind of stuff. He says, and really that's how most people operate. Okay? What happens is, so you got the far left and the far right are yelling at each other from the two extremes. And in the middle is just your average run-of-the-mill folks. They're just trying to get by. And Nixon says that's who he represents. He says they're the silent majority there. They don't get a lot of attention. Okay, I told you there wasn't much here. So we were going into the election of 72, so I had forgotten about C. Okay? All right. Domestic policy is not usually talked about with Nixon as much as the foreign policy, but the book will probably give you some other nuances as well. So I already told you about 72. Nixon's running for re-election. I've already told you who his opponent is, George McGovern. The next one should be the election map. Nixon's in blue. This is one of the great electoral bloodbaths of all times. This is just a good old-fashioned butt-kicking by Richard Nixon. Okay, now remember, he'd gotten elected in 68 with less than 50% of the vote. Okay, but now he has 4 years under his belt. People know what to expect. McGovern, I guess, had some issues there. And look at this. I mean, I can't even. It's like 60% of the popular vote. I mean, it is. I mean, it's embarrassing for poor George McGovern. Bless his heart. He wins Massachusetts and I think the District of Columbia. Okay, just a bloodbath, a bludgeoning. I mean, someone call the police. There's been a murder. Okay. Given this kind of re-election in '72, surely Nixon's going to go down in history as one of our most popular presidents ever, right? No, he's going to get trapped up in something called the Watergate affair, which is tied in with the election of '72. Okay, so I want you to remember this blue map because I can't go back to it once I go forward. All right, just remember this huge victory. Okay, this result revolves around something that happened prior to the election of '72. Okay, now I'm going to skip through a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, that slide at the beginning where I told you don't worry about all that E stuff. Yeah, we're going to skip over lots of it. Okay, because you can read about it in the book, but the notes have a level of detail that we just don't need. Okay, partially because when the notes were originally written, they were written by a guy who was like getting out of college around the time this is all happening. And remember, everybody thinks what happened when they were a teenager, young adult, is like the most important thing that ever happened. All right, but then more things happen, and we have to de-emphasize some stuff. All right, so let's talk about Watergate. Okay, all right, hang on a second. All right, I don't need you to know this, or this, or this, or this. I don't care about this. The CIA is kind of important, but let's not talk about that. I just want to give you the bare bones, okay? This picture is of the Watergate office complex, okay? It's like an office, hotel, big thing. It's where the Democratic National Headquarters is based, okay? That's overseeing, talking about what the Democrats are doing in the election of '72. Well, somebody comes up with a bright idea of breaking into Democratic National Convention, the Democratic National Committee headquarters, and try to see if they can find some paperwork, some ideas, things they could either use against McGovern or find out what the strategy is or what the Democrats hope to do against Nixon. Okay. Nowadays, you would just hack into their emails, right? But now, back then, you had to do it the old-fashioned way. You had to go in there and actually break into the office. Okay. So there's a break-in in June of '72. This is before the election, right? There's a bunch of, and the guys get caught by a security guard. Okay, I think I've got a picture of him here. All right. Don't worry about all these names. Don't care. You don't need to know. But these people were arrested breaking into Democratic National Convention. National Committee headquarters. Okay. Now the idea to do this apparently originated at CREEP. CRP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, which is overseen by a guy named John Mitchell, the one who came up with this idea. All right? But then these people have been caught. Now, this is where it starts getting crazy. Okay? Did Nixon know about this prior to it happening? I don't know if there's any evidence that he did. Okay? What happens, though, this would be embarrassing to come out in election year, that the Republicans were trying to break into Democratic headquarters. And so what happens is Nixon gets involved in a cover-up. Okay? So it's the big question turns into, what did the president know? And when did he know it? Okay? All right. So, at some point, Nixon finds out what's going on. Now, think back to that blue map I showed you, okay, which is in November. Given the huge majority Nixon had in November, okay, maybe his best bet in June, in retrospect, would just go on TV and say, my fellow Americans, I have found that people working for my campaign have perpetrated this crime, and I'm demanding a full investigation to get to the bottom of it, and, trust me, we will. he might have been able to pull it off. Even if he lost 5 or 6% of the vote, he might have still got reelected. But instead, because this would be an embarrassment, he gets involved in trying to cover it up. Okay, and so, like I said, the big question is always, how much did the president know, and at what point did he know it? Okay, now. Turns out that Nixon's recording everything that's in the White House, okay, because he's thinking, well, someday there'll be records, and they want to write a book, and they want records of what was going on, and then some of these meetings. So if Congress is trying to investigate this, they're subpoenaing the paperwork. I mean, the transcripts. Well, Nixon doesn't want to turn them over, so there's all these legal court challenges and stuff. So none of which I'll go into, but it might be. Let's go to the next slide because I don't care about all these guys. See all this? I mean, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. It just goes on and on and on and on. I don't need you to know this. I don't care about that. I don't care about this. I really don't even care about that. I want you to know this. Okay? All right. We're talking televised hearings. We're talking subpoenas. We're talking lawsuits over releasing records and stuff, missing gaps in tapes where they've been mysteriously erased. This goes on for months and months on television. It's mind-numbing, okay? All of which you can read about in the book if you'd like, okay? Here's the upshot, though, okay? At some point, the House of Representatives starts drawing up impeachment papers against Richard Nixon for obstruction of justice because he's trying to obstruct this investigation into the Watergate break-in. Okay? Nixon, realizing that he's losing support, and apparently some Republicans went and told him they didn't think they could save him if it went to the Senate. Nixon will decide to resign. Okay? So Richard Nixon is not impeached. Only 3 presidents have ever been impeached. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, which we won't get to, and Richard Nixon. I'm sorry. Donald J. Trump. Let me repeat that properly. Only 3 presidents have ever actually been through the impeachment process. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald J. Trump. Nixon is not impeached. He probably would have been impeached. Now, whether the Senate would have found him guilty or not, we don't know because it never happened. What he decides to do is resign from the White House. He'll resign the presidency. Okay? The only man to ever do so. Okay? We got some aftermath here on this, but I'm looking at the time clock coming up here. I'm coming up on the 13 minutes. I think I'd be really hard-pressed to cram it all in before I hit the deadline. So let me stop here, come back with one last little video to wrap this thing up.